I'm putting together a worksheet with a few things on it relating to what I want to do moving forward, which is provide some options. So simple things about safety like the representation agreement and advanced directive. And I used a group called nidus or nidus, Nidus, to put mine together. And then I have my medical ID in my phone. And then I'm also considering getting a medical ID bracelet with something on it to the effect that long-term antipsychotics or antipsychotics over 14 days gives me an anesthesia reaction, and I don't want to be on any of them. So the one thing about that though is I don't know if I want to be walking around with the word antipsychotic or no on my body, but at the same time it could be helpful. I'm just wondering if there's a way to frame that without having to write that stuff, because I talked to the company and they said I can write whatever I want. So I could write, go stick a stick up your butt if you try to pathologize me, something like that. But at the same time, I'm not against being pathologized if I'm sort of past the point of no return. And there's a way that's helpful to me, and there's ways that are definitely not helpful. And I feel like with different things in place, I can possibly step up my level of attempting to thrive. And then if I attempt to thrive so much so that at some point it appears that I attempt suicide, well, then that happens. But at least I'll be pulled back to some version of my ego self. And then also the zap strap idea, having a zap strap, and my PRN. So those are some of my safety tools. Not safety as in, oh, and now I'm going to protect myself from crisis, but safety in that if I venture too far into unknown territory, like inner unknown territory, then I can keep myself safe. And then I also wrote on the spiritual emergence network. That's a safety tool for dialogue, plus emotional CPR training, which I'm hoping to bring here, and the Voices and Visions Study Club and the Voices and Visions Support Group. As I found when I went to the group, they were very much not into pathologizing that particular so-called symptom. And I even have their group guidelines, and it says, accept that voices and visions are a real experience. Same with anything that I've talked about for me, it's real for me. Sanctions the freedom to interpret experiences in any way. I like this one about the facilitator is not under any pressure to report back to anyone clinically. And the facilitator said that other interpretations are more empowering and meaningful. And I was thinking about that this morning. I was thinking about if I want to put a positive spin on this diagnosis I've been given, right then and there it would be scientifically proven that I would be expected to have better results. So even if it is wanting to be called a pathology by some professional people, if I put a positive spin on it, it's going to help me. And not just positive spin as in, oh, I can recover. That's the going positive spin right now. It's no, I can use some of these strengths and abilities that I've gained. I've gained empathy, I've gained sensitivity, and that makes it difficult to function sometimes, but those are actually abilities, and those sensitivities I can use actually to interpret and find meaning in my experience. So by saying the experience is not meaningful is actually denying some of the main faculties that one gains through this process, which is empathy and compassion, because the process is so jarring and it's so vast that it definitely expands one's range of one's ability to sense and perceive things. We can only really see something that we have the context for, and by being given this vast array of context, now we're more sensitive to so many things. And the thing is that the way society's designed, most of the stuff that we would move towards in society naturally, when we're programmed, we actually will recoil from when we lose that programming, because we see that it's dangerous and it's not actually how we're naturally wired as human beings. A lot of times when they create groups or something and people that have been isolating for a long time, they actually start coming out. It's because it's something that is how we're naturally wired as human beings, like gardening, for example. It feels safe, it feels natural. Whereas if you say to someone, come out and we're going to give you electric shock treatment, they're probably not going to come out. And that's the other extreme. But it is something that's out there. And another guideline is make no assumption of illness. So I like that one, because if I was to go to this group, even though I've been diagnosed with an illness, I actually don't feel that I have an illness in my heart. And if I did feel like I had an illness in my heart and I took it to heart, that would probably become a self-fulfilling prophecy. I'd always have the lens and the lookout for anything that could be construed as illness. And then if I saw something, I would go to my doctor, and then they'd give me another pill, and then it would just go on like that, and it would just spiral. I actually showed my little niece a picture that I saw on Instagram, and both women were 80 years old. And one looked like an 80-year-old woman with a cane and white hair, and the other 80-year-old woman had a six-pack, had beautiful skin, was smiling, was just in incredible shape, better shape than I'm in, that's for sure. And so it's those little choices that gets a person to one extreme or the other. And for me, having a diagnosis, that puts me in a field of choices that could actually quickly lead me to death or morbidity of some kind. Like if I was to go on medication that made me eat more, and then all of a sudden I have diabetes, and then I need more pills for that, I would look completely different than I look right now. And right now I'm not even the healthiest that I've been, but I see that because I've been put in this paradigm with this lens where I can be funneled into these choices that I wouldn't choose for myself, I have to be even more aware of the choices I do make for myself, because if I don't make even better choices, I'm going to have less of a choice as time goes on. Like if I don't eat healthy, I'm going to likely end up with diabetes or something, because being on medications already would predispose my body to becoming out of balance and things like that. And I was at one point probably about 30 pounds more than I am now, and I started to make choices with the help of one of those apps for tracking food to really see that I was eating way too much. So at first I cut my junk back by not eating as much, and then I started to put in the healthy foods, and that's how I lost 10 pounds. And I wasn't sure if I'd ever be able to lose anything, because I was on this medication that was sort of keeping me at that equilibrium, but I was also making poor food choices based on craving those sorts of foods based on being on that medication. So I had to break that cycle. So the next part of this sheet about the spiritual emergence network and the groups is that this group is a group that doesn't pathologize. So I would say I'm kind of a vision seer, extraordinary experiencer, and when I went to the group, I was impressed that people actually knew what open dialogue was. And they knew about these other strategies. So just being around people that have other experiences that would commonly be pathologized, that choose not to pathologize themselves, is empowering. And I would like to do that more often. And then I did go to California to be trained as a spiritual emergence coach, and I haven't really utilized that. I need to look at it again and see what it is that a person can do with that. It's group-based, so it would be another group similar to Voices and Visions. And I think maybe after I see the Healing Voices movie next week, I'll have a better idea of what I want to do with that. And so after the personal safety measures, like safety from the system and safety from self, with the ZAP strap, the representation agreement, then with the dialogue, also safety with the Spiritual Emergence Network crisis line, and then the support groups of Voices and Visions, and also Spiritual Emergence Coach group. It's also really important to have happiness, embodied mania, or whatever one chooses to call it. So that's the thriving element. So once one feels safe and connected and supported in a non-pathologizing way, but also ready to be pathologized if need be, because that is the main system of crisis response right now. So I'm ready to be pathologized, but I'm also protected in that I won't be pathologized in the way that almost ensured chronicity for me. I barely managed to escape, so I'm wondering why I'm trying to put myself back into that stressful, poisonous paradigm, which would potentiate the probability of me going into a crisis and then needing that kind of thing. So the third is happiness and embodied mania. And, that could be creating a meetup group, being creatively maladjusted, or what I like to say is creatively adjusted, because it's society that's maladjusted. So when we're doing something different, we're actually being adjusted, and we're actually adjusting society. And there's another one, which is options. There's a book, Choices in Recovery, I think I've mentioned, and it has a lot of different evidence-based stuff for people that want to design their own recovery, if you want to use that word. And I would say design rediscovery and recreation of oneself. And it could be good to have a RAP plan, Wellness Recovery Action Plan. I have one of those. I have the app. And also Tom Wooten's Bipolar in Order is a really good one for starting to test the whole thrive thing. He talks about being in an uncomfortable state, but being able to act in order, versus being in an uncomfortable state and being in disorder. And when you're in disorder, that's when you have to enact a plan to bring yourself back to order. And then you can try and step into that again, which kind of naturally happens anyway. But he's all about allowing ourselves to practice being in those uncomfortable states and practice being in order, versus just getting freaked out at the first sign of one little anxious thought. And I would say I did this 2 weeks ago when I started to feel quite distressed, and I took a week off work, and it totally worked. Like, I went back to being in order, and just it took a few days, but then I felt fine. Whereas if I would have not done that, I don't know what would have happened. I cried in front of one of my friends, and there's nothing wrong with that. But if that became like a daily occurrence, and I don't think that friend has ever seen me cry, and I generally don't cry very often at all. So it worked. And I think for me, what I'm wanting to explore for myself is coming off medications. And that's sort of the last bit, is being supported, connected, safe, happy, For me, I don't think it's a good idea until I have a living environment that is more quiet and peaceful, because that adds a lot of stress. Because when I really think about it, I would rather be able to say that I'm not on any medications and I'm managing or even thriving, versus being on meds and working in the system. So I might try and work with the EMP people, because I have a naturopath, but he said it's not within his scope of practice to switch me to lithium orotate, I think. So I can imagine that after I hopefully have the ECPR people come here and do training, and have moved to a quiet place, I can get off the lithium. I'm on a pretty small dose. I don't think there's any point in really risking my stability before Christmas. I've already voted from the psych ward, celebrated a birthday in the psych ward. I don't need to celebrate Christmas in the psych ward. I'm definitely feeling the impulse to be embodied, to go ice skating, to work on my posture and my structure and everything, and those things will have an effect to make it so my body lasts longer. Because I've talked about before how I think everything mental is illness in a way, or is dis-ease. If we're mentalizing about stuff, then we're not really at ease with the present moment. So I've done a lot of unfolding meaning for myself with these experiences, but at the same time, they're all mentalizations away from the present moment. Or in a way, the present moment I had become needed all this mentalization and meaning making in order to get actually to the present moment that I'm meant to be in. So it's not really the mentalizations that have meaning as much. They were necessary to get there. For example, if I have a mentalization that I need to kill myself, it's going to get me to a moment where I might think I need to kill myself, where nothing really could be happening in the moment to actually justify the fact that that needs to happen, besides the words, the mentalizing. And mentalizing is like mental lies. They're lies. I could be thinking about anything right now, but the fact of the matter is I'm just sitting here in my living room. And anything moving away from that would be like saying, well, I don't want to be sitting here in my living room. I want to be thinking about something else. And I think a lot of the people who critique not thinking have never put the work in to get to that state, and to see that it's very similar to the thinking state. There's just not all these words going on, and we don't necessarily understand that words don't need to be going on in order for us to actually act based on the intelligence of the body, not on the abstractions and conceptualizations of the mind, which usually aren't congruent with what is happening with the body. So we turn the body into a habit in order to be lost in our abstractions, giving us maybe dopamine or something like that. When, if we're in the moment acting without thought, we're getting that perception of that action versus the abstractions, and not having the perception of the action. It's almost like we don't even feel our body anymore. And maybe we don't feel it partly because it's in a lot of pain, because we never were able to act in the moment. Oftentimes when we experience pain, we've recorded something that somebody says that we see as painful. Or we record something that's pleasurable. And then those are the moments we recall as memories to vacillate between pleasure and pain. What I'm saying is, if we're just going between pleasure and pain in our own head based on our own abstractions, we're not actually in contact with our body and our gestures. And when we are in contact with that, what's being recorded is nothing. It's just all passing through us, with us, as the moment, in the moment, with the moment. And I even made a note of something that kind of rings true. It seems like supposed mental illness is attaching different meanings to life than the one we've been programmed to attach to life. For example, education is success. Getting a good job that pays well is success. And then often people that get highly educated and get a supposed good job, they don't feel happy. And then that's when all that mentalization is happening in order to allow them to cope with the fact that they're so far away from their innate happiness, because they've been tricked into putting all their life energy and money into training and education to get this good job. Success is always away from the moment. And success away from the moment is a thought. And if we're always thinking that success is in the future, it will always be in the future. And if we think that success is a certain thing, that's a thought, when we get that thing, we're going to realize that's not happiness. So these other meaning makings that get so extreme that they're seen as hallucinations and delusions are actually a way for us to see different meanings, to get us away from our programmed meanings. But those aren't necessarily the meanings of life either. It's just sort of a process to see, oh, there are other meanings, and oh, any meaning can be attached to anything. And when one sees that any meaning can be attached to anything along the way, none of it means anything in particular. And that's another thing, is to have a delusion, supposed delusion, that is attaching apparent meaning to something, or thinking something, or having a certain belief. It can just be a passing thing, like a cloud, like, oh, that's nice. But if, say, I was to all of a sudden believe something, then it can become problematic, because now I start comparing everything to that belief, and then things get really confusing. So part of it is that who is the one that believes? Well, usually it has to be some kind of center, some kind of ego structure. So once we attach even like a really high belief to something, well, now we've recreated that ego center. When the believer and the belief are one and the same, it's the same process. It's this trying to attach to something. Part of what I think has helped me along the way is to not really believe any of it. So if I talk about an experience, well, that was interesting, but it's not something to be believed. Part of this process too, this meaning-making process, shows us that we can make infinite meanings. And if we don't attach to any of them, then it just keeps going. And I think at some point, when some of those meaning-making things that happen start to level off in terms of, say, like being too high or too low or too odd, I think that's when the brain's natural learning process is re-equilibrated. It's like, okay, well, now it's just learning without accumulating anything, because in the same way that a brain can create infinite meanings as it goes along in the day, when those meanings actually become learnings, they become insights, and then they're like, oh, that's interesting, versus, whoa, that's so far out there. And I think that's part of the process, is getting to a place where the brain can learn without attaching to things and being taken away by it. So when I have insights into things, they usually just come up naturally, and then sometimes there'll be one that comes out of nowhere that's way beyond what I was even learning about or inquiring about in my brain. And then it's kind of like, oh, that's nice. It's sort of like an outlier. But when a person, like if I was in an extreme state, those outliers would be coming all the time, and it gets to be a bit much, because if I'm sort of inquiring within a certain range and there's an outlier, if it's just sort of dropped instead of clinged onto, and then all these other outliers start coming, and it's not able to make, my brain's not able to make any sense of it. So I think part of the process is just the brain reestablishing learning, actual learning, how we used to learn. And I've talked about this in previous videos about the mind screen and pattern recognition versus binary good, bad, positive, negative, pleasure, pain. I came across this Mad in America article by Ron Unger, and he says that he's talking about criticism around the biomedical model, biochemical imbalance in the brain theory, but instead they try to convince us that scientific consensus exists around a notion of biochemical imbalances, which actually lacks evidence, and they frame the drugs as handily correcting the problem, even though the actual evidence suggests that the drugs create a biologically abnormal state of suppressed dopamine, and that this in turn causes the brain to shrink, etc. And so when I read that, I found it interesting, because I've been talking quite a bit about dopamine and how if these drugs suppress dopamine, it's sort of suppressing something with the ego, and I'm not sure what, and I don't have time to talk about it right now. I have to go to a meeting, so I'll think about it. But it's interesting that those drugs act on dopamine. It suggests that something's sort of gone wrong with the dopamine, and I think what's gone wrong with the dopamine is that the dopamine is just wrong, and something else is trying to be established, but that could be part of the ego band-aid. It acts on dopamine somehow, and by suppressing this dopamine, maybe it's trying to explode and implode on itself, but these medications come in and kind of keep this dopamine thing going to some extent, this ego self, and maybe that's necessary for now, but it's just really interesting that I saw that.